I'm Dr. David Bernstein. Welcome back to our series, 25 Tips for Working with Modes. Now, over the last several videos, we've been talking about repeating patterns in people's lives and different ways in which we can look at those patterns. We can look at them in terms of people's modes, how they're triggered in a particular situation, and the kind of sequence of the modes that can then recur over and over again. Or we can take the long view of somebody's life and look over all those moments in the course of somebody's life when a particular kind of mode got triggered, and then we can view it in terms of early maladaptive schemas. And last time we talked about the fact that schemas and modes are really two sides of the same coin. So, but why all this attention to these patterns? Well, obviously the reason is we want to help people to break those patterns, okay? But how do we do that? And that brings us to today's topic, which is don't feed it. Okay, now, what does that mean, don't feed it? Well, it refers to a relatively new concept in schema therapy, which was introduced by Limor Navot, and that is feeding the modes. Now, how do we define feeding the modes? Well, feeding the modes is a kind of explanation for why modes get perpetuated. Why do people keep getting triggered in the same old way? And how do those modes get reinforced? And here's how it works. The idea is that, when our modes are triggered, that we tend to see the mode as real. Or to put it differently, the mode dominates how we view things, how we perceive things, how we feel and how we think, and how we cope at a particular moment. And as a result of it, the mode may lead us to perceive things in a way that we think are real, right? So we perceive things from the perspective of our modes. And then we go a step further. We tend to act in ways based on that perception of reality that reinforce our modes. Okay, so there are two parts of this definition. The first one is the way in which modes cause us to confuse, our perceptions for reality. And the second part of it has to do with acting upon those perceptions of reality in ways that reinforce the mode. Now, let me give you an example. And this is an example from the case of Ron, which, I mentioned a few videos ago. And this is a young man who comes to treatment because he keeps getting into the same kinds of fights with his girlfriend. He perceives that there's some kind of repeating pattern going on, and indeed there is. And the pattern always has to do with a conflict about Ron's freedom. He wants to go out, with his friends several times a week, and he sees the hurt look on his girlfriend's face, and he feels, and he thinks to himself, she's trying to control me. And then at that moment, he explodes in anger. And so at that moment, Ron doesn't recognize that he's in a mode. His mode, when it's triggered, his angry child mode, determines how he's viewing the situation. It causes him to perceive certain things as being real. She is trying to control me. Now, you could ask yourself, well, isn't she really trying to control him? I mean, maybe she really is trying to control him. Well, it could be to some degree that that's true. And yet, the mode also represents more than just the present situation. It also represents Ron's past. Because, as we discussed, that feeling of, somebody trying to control me, kind of suffocating me, is one that Ron, recognized also in his childhood, in his relationship with his mother. And so in the moment when that mode is triggered, it's as if there's kind of a confusion between the past and the present. Our modes in a way represent our past, which we then bring to the present situation, right? So when they're triggered, they determine, we tend to view things from the perspective of our past, from our early wounds, and how we learn to cope with them. And that, colors the way in which we perceive the present situation. And so now in that moment, when Ron is feeling like, she is trying to control me, and it's not fair, it's not right, he feels powerless. Okay? And what does he do? He tries to turn the tables on her by going on the attack. He starts saying mean or demeaning things toward her. He can get really nasty with her. And at that moment, he goes from feeling powerless to feeling powerful. So not only is he perceiving the situation, she's trying to control me as, reality, but he's now acting upon it in ways that reinforce it. How so? Because when Ron goes on the attack, he takes the one-up position. And when he takes the one-up position, he feels better. He gets a little squirt of dopamine in his brain, kind of little reward, neurochemical reward, because now he's feeling powerful, he's feeling dominant, instead of feeling powerless and controlled. And furthermore, he's escaping from how it feels when he's in his angry child mode, where again, he's feeling so helpless. And so, you can explain the reinforcement of Ron's modes by, simple operant conditioning. So the moment he flips into his bullying attack mode, he's essentially feeding his modes and therefore reinforcing them. Now, from that point forward, things happen in a predictable way. Then he feels guilty. He feels, I must be a terrible person, for being so mean to her. And yeah, okay, again, you could say, well, isn't it reasonable that Ron should feel some sense of guilt? Well, of course it is. But, his mode goes a step further than that, right? His mode is, I am a terrible person. And at that moment, he doesn't realize that that's the voice of his inner critic mode. And again, that is a mode from his past, right? That's a mode that he developed when he was growing up, feeling terribly responsible for things and very often feeling guilty about, different situations that he was really not responsible for. And so again, he's confusing the past, his mode, with the present, And so at that moment, he's losing sight of the fact that he's in a mode and instead just simply feels, this is reality. I am a bad person. And then again, he acts upon that sense of reality by submitting to his girlfriend's demands. He says, okay, I won't go out with my friends tonight. So again, he flips into a new mode. He goes from his inner critic mode, that critical, internalized parent mode, into a one-down mode, the compliant surrenderer mode. And again, there's a kind of sense of relief because when he gives into her demands, he doesn't have to feel so guilty anymore. And so again, he's reinforcing his modes. He's feeding his mode by complying with her demands. Now, one of the implications of this is that, feeding the modes can involve different ways of, coping and acting, right? The first time he takes the one-up position, goes into the bullying attack mode, and that's an example of feeding his modes. And the second time he takes the one-down position, and he's again feeding his modes. Anytime he's confusing his mode with reality and then acting to try to, solve the problem of how he's perceiving reality, what can I do now that I'm being controlled or that I'm a bad person, and trying to act on the basis of that perceived reality in ways that further reinforce his modes, he is feeding his modes. Now, what are some of the implications of this? The first is the following, that when we're in modes, in a way it robs us of our free choice. That it's as if the mode is making a choice for us, So at that time, it's not as though we really even recognize that we're in a mode, much less that we have a choice about what to do. Because ultimately what we would like is for people to recognize those moments when they're triggered, that indeed they are in a mode, and be able to stop and be able to sort of become more aware of what their possible choices are. Because ultimately, any given moment when your mode is triggered, you've got a choice, and that choice is between feeding the modes and feeding your healthy adult mode. In other words, do you want to go and give in to that old repeating pattern and do things that unconsciously reinforce your modes, making them worse? Or pause and take a moment, kind of a moment of self-awareness, and then ask yourself, am I in a mode now? And what are my choices here? Do I have some alternative choices, some healthier choices in this present moment? Okay. Now, sounds good, but maybe easier said than done. It's not so easy when people's modes have been reinforced over and over and over again, to get them to take a step back and to recognize that they have a choice and that they're in a mode, and look at some healthy alternative behaviors at that moment. So how can we do that? How can we help them then to be more aware at that moment and make a choice? The answer is, we want to help people to learn to bring more mindful awareness to their modes, at those moments when they're triggered. And how do we do that? Well, that's going to bring us to the topic that we're going to focus on next time, and that is bring some mindful attention to your modes at those moments when they're triggered. And I'd like to invite you to come to our website, www.imodes.com, and take a look at our image-based therapy tools. And have a great week, and see you next time.